Good evening. My name's Patrick Kennelly. I'm the director of the Marquette University Center for Peacemaking. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight to hear Dr. Terrence Rynne present on his new book. Before I get to the introduction, I want to take care of some housekeeping details. There's a sign-in sheet for the Center for Peacemaking in the back. If you're not on our mailing list, please do sign in. And then also there's a sign-in sheet for Dr. Kankar's class. If you're here for her class and would like to make sure that she knows you're here, make sure you sign in there too. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rynne. Terry is a mentor and inspiration for many of us here at Marquette. He's accomplished many things throughout his life, and I don't want to take too much time, but let me try rattling off at least a handful. He earned a PhD in theology here at Marquette. He had a successful career in marketing. He previously taught at the seminary in Chicago. He's the co-president of the Sally and Terry Rynne Foundation. He's the co-founder of the Marquette Center for Peacemaking. He's the recipient of the Dick Ringler Peace Educator Award in Wisconsin, which acknowledges peace educators in higher education who've made a significant accomplishment to the field on a national level. He teaches in our Peace Studies program here at Marquette. He's the author of 3 books. His second book, Gandhi and Jesus, received national acclaim, international acclaim really, including from Desmond Tutu. And Kofi Annan read that book at the UN. It's currently in its second printing here in the US, as well as recently has been translated into Spanish and is being published in South America. In Terry's new book, Jesus Christ Peacemaker, he offers us a new theology of peace, a theology based on the life of Jesus, and explores how Jesus was a practitioner of nonviolence. This book also has attracted national attention, and I want to repeat a couple things that I've heard about the text. Bishop Thomas Gumbleton wrote, "Here is a book that truly recovers the original gospel ethic. Jesus rejected violence for any reason whatsoever. Perhaps our church will begin again to be a peace church and deserve to hear Jesus announce to us, 'Blessed are the peacemakers.'" Marie Dennis, president of Pax Christi International, wrote, "Moving beyond the theoretical debate about the morality of war, Terrence Rynne insists that our vocation as Christians is to active, nonviolent, persistent, risky, creative peacemaking, and shows us clearly how an evolving Catholic theology of peace increasingly reflects that emphasis." It's my honor and admiration to introduce Terrence Rynne.
And we have 17 grandchildren. Yes, that's my biggest pride. Thank you for coming.
I think
Pat's going to interview.
Right.
It's going to be a good. He's going to ask questions so you can ask questions.
Good. And this is meant to be an informal discussion to help clarify our thoughts. So I have 3 questions for Terry, but I hope that you guys, as you hear things or have brought things to the room, you'll also jump in the conversation. So let's begin. Terry, and I read this book about a year ago, and when Terry was putting the finishing touches on it, you strongly say Jesus is nonviolent. What do you mean by that?
Wow, what a good question, Pat. I think the question is very appropriate. Jesus was nonviolent personally, if I start with that. There are 2 incidents in the Gospels that express that very clearly. You may be familiar with them. The first time he went back to his hometown in Nazareth, he upset the people. They couldn't believe that somebody that had grown up, that they had known as a child, was talking this way, challenging them, but telling them things they really had not heard in that way. And it says that they got so angry, they took him outside to the brow of a hill, and people have located that outside of Nazareth. It's a deep gully, and were ready to throw him off the cliff. And the gospel says, and he walked right through them. Now there's a number of examples. How did he do that? A number of examples of Gandhi doing very similar things when he was working so hard to eliminate untouchability. Some of the Sanatani Hindus, those who were very orthodox, surrounded him when he was walking down the street one day. There were a couple hundred. And they were violently angry with him. And he looked at them, and people who witnessed it can describe why. Because of it, why he walked right through the middle of them. Because of his own inner peace, because of the way he looked at them in the eye, because he was not afraid. And so I can only assume that incident in the gospel about Jesus, that he had similar strengths. Another one is even more graphic. A woman is taken in adultery, and in the Jewish religion at that time, they said she should die. And so there are all kinds of men gathered around her with stones in their hands, ready to stone her to death. And Jesus walked up to this group, sailed into the violence, and bent over, and in front of them started writing in the dust. We don't know what he was writing. I don't think that's relevant. He was giving them time to simmer down, and then you may know the words that he spoke. He said, "The one among you who is without sin, cast the first stone." And they're very graphic description, because it says the older men left first, and the young men who were still hyped up, ready to start throwing stones, eventually left. And he said to the woman, said, "Is anybody here to judge you?" And she says, "They've all gone. I don't judge you either, but, don't do that again." So, people talk about what would you do if your mother or your brother, wouldn't that be the only thing you could do if they were, and that's been the excuse for so much violence, that line of thinking. And, quite graphic example of him walking into violence, changing it without violence, and subduing it. So as a personal characteristic, that's one way to understand nonviolence. It's definitely deeply in him. But I think more importantly is to ask the question, was he a peacemaker? And I'd say yes, he was a peacemaker who used the power of nonviolence. And I have 4 tests or 4 challenges. Who's a peacemaker? First, peacemaker is someone who assertively resists oppression. How can anybody or a group of people be at peace if they're under the boot heel of oppression or worried about the threat of violence? So I think that's the first basic task, and we'll see, does Jesus fit that description? And secondly, I'm sure you've learned about structural violence, that violence gets embedded in a culture. I'm thinking of a young man in our family who has he's a grandnephew. He has not just a misdemeanor, but he has a felony on his record. And it's been a long time since he's been out of jail. And it is so difficult for him. He's a young black man to get a job. Violence gets right into attitudes, structures, habits of a society. Any peacemaker recognizes that it's not enough to change individuals. You have to be willing to take on the institutions of the society if they have baked into them violence and oppression. Third, a peacemaker reconciles people, especially people that have been in situations in Rwanda, in South Africa, anywhere violence has been a long time in place. We all have long memories. How do you ever get out of that cycle unless you reconcile people? And I'd say, let's look at Jesus. Let's look at the gospel. See, does he measure up to that? And fourth, a peacemaker presents, because peace, most of the time we think of peace as a negative. It's not having violence, not having war. But peace, positive peace, a much better word really is shalom. Isaiah and Micah, they talk about shalom. And here's the picture they give. Swords are turned into plowshares. Pruning hooks are turned into things to pluck fruit with. And everyone sits under their own vine and fig tree. So violence turns into productive food, turns into a situation where people are together and calm and enjoying the fullness of their potential as individuals. So shalom. John the 23rd, Pope, 1963, wrote a marvelous document called Peace on Earth, Pacem in Terris. And the first time in the history of the Catholic Church, he proclaimed the importance of human rights. And he said, peace is like a cathedral. It needs to be built. And we don't have peace unless we enjoy the fullness of human rights, which, we're increasingly understanding. Well, let's look at Jesus' life. And, it is funny how Jesus' life is sort of overlooked. There are creeds in Christianity, Nicene Creed, Apostles' Creed, and they go like this. They say, he was born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, died and was buried. Did we miss anything? He was born of the Virgin Mary, died. What happened to his life? I mean, if we're going to learn, we learn from the way he lived. So I asked a question of myself. I asked it many years ago. And I said, why did Jesus die? The book Gandhi and Jesus goes into that pretty extensively. And it's pretty simple. He died because he was killed. Why was he killed? He stood up to the powers that be of his time. He not only stood up to them, he challenged them, he tried to reach them, he tried to give them a different, better vision of their own Judaism. So, let's think about who those powers that be were. I think it's very important to start there. The more we understand about Jesus' environment and his culture, the more clearly we can begin to understand what he was about. 4 facts about his environment. First one, they're an occupied country. Rome conquered them in 63 BC. Caesar Augustus is Octavian. He's just defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He's the emperor. The only thing they care about is having revenue come to them and having a country be peaceful. So they do indeed gather much tribute from the Palestine of Jesus' time. To keep people peaceful, they name their leader. And Caesar Augustus had a friend growing up in Rome. And he appoints him, he's Herod the Great. Let me say a thing about Herod the Great. He's the king when Jesus is born. Herod the Great built the most magnificent structures in the ancient world. The temple in Jerusalem was the wonder of the world. People came from all over just to see the temple. He built a town on the Mediterranean, Caesarea, after Caesar. You can still see the aqueduct, the huge Colosseum there on the banks of the Mediterranean. You can still see pillars that go out into the Mediterranean. Huge pillars that were the basis of piers that made that whole area then a seaport for the rest of that world. He built in the Judean desert. If you have any picture of the Judean desert overlooking the Dead Sea, it's the most desolate place I've ever seen. Maybe on the earth. Dead Sea is the lowest point on the face of the earth. Masada. Does anybody know that name? Masada. It's going to be the place where the last remnants of the Jews are killed. In fact, killed themselves at the time of the revolution against Rome. But Masada is this magnificent palace in the middle of nowhere. Where is he getting that money to build those? Also from the backs of the people. The only source of wealth really in those times, there's no Microsoft, it's all land. So people are really stretched and seething with anger. The third group, the priests. Now the Sanhedrin is the day-to-day ruler. They've been in and out of power. Under Pilate, they're back in power. And the high priest, you know the role of the high priest in the temple, once a year. The temple, the Holy of Holies, is where God dwells. All of goodness exudes from the Holy of Holies into the temple, and then into Jerusalem, then into the rest of the country. He has the privilege of going there once a year. He is appointed by Pilate. Pilate keeps his vestments, there's such power of Rome, and gives them to him when he's supposed to go into the temple. But the priests, Josephus, a writer from this time, describes the high priest's goons going out and stealing grain from the people and from the junior priests. They're in power for 40 years, this one family, Caiaphas. They're not attractive people, and they too contribute to this oppression. And the fourth group is the Pharisees. Pharisees is a reform group, a lay group, who want to see Judaism survive and thrive. And so the way they think they can do that is by having people be so diligent and so pure and so kept from the influences of Greco-Roman culture that they can stay together. But there's a Shammai is one of the popular rabbis of the time. Pharisees differ from Sadducees. You need to know all this, but the Pharisees believe we need an oral tradition. All the oral commentaries that people have made on the Jewish scriptures, they need to be obeyed as a fence around the written tradition. The Sadducees only believe in the written law. Of the 350 rules of Shammai for people, 256 of them have to do with food. And the Pharisees are saying to the people, really to be holy, and holy means separate for them, you have to maintain and obey these laws. At every stage of the food production and eating process, you have to give a tithe to the temple. religion reinforcing, buttressing what is a very unfair system. There's a town 4 miles, if you've ever heard the name Sepphoris. There's a town 4 miles from Nazareth where Jesus grew up, just over the hills. It's called Sepphoris. It was the capital of Galilee. When Herod the Great died, Judas the Galilean led a revolt. And the first thing they did was attack Sepphoris, get the armaments, and destroy all the records of debts. Because people are dying from their debt burden. They're losing their lands. They're seething with anger. Judas Galilean taps that. Well, what does Rome do? Rome comes, and Josephus describes them not only destroying this rebellion, but crucifying out in public 2,000 people. This is the environment Jesus is born into and grows up in. Okay, here's a second fact. In Mark's Gospel, the 3rd chapter, he says the Pharisees went out and conspired with the Herodians, the party of Herod, to find ways to kill Jesus. 3rd chapter. If you read the New Testament again, more with these eyes, ask yourself, why were they so angry that early? And you'll see all the conflicts that Jesus has entered into with them by the 3rd chapter. What is he doing? 1, he is aware that this path that they're on, of this kind of anger, they think the Messiah has got to be someone who throws out the Romans. It takes him the whole Gospels to convince his own disciples that he's not that kind of a Messiah. And he demonstrates it in the way he acts and what he teaches. But that was so strong and so deep in the culture. Why? Because 100 years before, the Maccabees had succeeded in throwing out the Seleucids. So they're thinking, yeah, let's go after Rome. Jesus is aware of this kind of dynamic. And it says when he came into the city of Jerusalem, he looked at the city and he wept. He said, if only you had known the ways of peace. He can see where it's heading. I wanted to take you under my wings as a chicken does her chicks. He knew what could happen and would happen. You know that it did happen. In the year 66, they rebelled. In the year 70, everything was destroyed. The temple, the remnant, and they were sent ever after, the Jews, into a diaspora. So it was a real central concern to him to show a different way. You don't have to accommodate, you don't have to fight, and you don't have to flight. Here's what you do. Love your enemies. Oh, really? Yeah. Love your enemies. To change them from enemies, take away the enmity. He resists the main cultural embodiments of violence, which are, in his time, the temple, the Torah, and the Sabbath. He resists the way they're practicing those 3 important pillars of Judaism. In fact, the one incident immediately preceding their getting together with the Herodians shows Jesus healing somebody with a withered arm on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees get all upset. He says, the Sabbath is made for human beings, not the other way around. It's a very important, it's the way people stay together, how they reactivate their own spirits. Sabbath is so important, but see it for what it is. don't say it's wrong to heal somebody. And he continually fights the way that they're interpreting the Torah as a way of exclusion. And you know, he eats with the people that they say are outcasts. He celebrates, you know, the great story of Zacchaeus when he comes into Jericho. And Zacchaeus is the head tax collector, so biggest sinner around. He's collecting money for Rome, and he's dealing with Gentiles all the time. So he's an outcast. He climbs into a tree looking down. He's short. He just wants to catch sight of Jesus. Jesus says, Zacchaeus, I don't know how he knows him. Maybe he'd already gotten some advance. Zacchaeus, come down. I'm going to spend the night in your house. And Zacchaeus says, if I've defrauded anybody, I'm going to restore it fourfold. I'm going to give half of my wealth to the poor. And Jesus says, salvation has come to this house. Notice, he didn't say, Zacchaeus, you have to repent. You have to confess your sins. Then you'll be forgiven. It's just the opposite. He reaches out. And Zacchaeus then says, I'm changing my life. So, in the temple, the cleansing of the temple, when he says, he knows what's happened. You've made my house, my father's house, into a den of thieves. So he's trying to reach them. The more you see the dialogue with the Pharisees, he tries gentle persuasion, he tries shaming them, he tries very aggressive halakhic disputation, and some of them he does reach, but he doesn't reach them all. Jesus is a peacemaker. He tries to resist and overcome oppression. The very first thing he says in Luke, he came into the synagogue and he takes down a scroll and he reads from Isaiah. The poor have the good news preached to them, the prisoners go free, and you have declared to you, brought into your presence, a year of jubilee. What's he talking about? He's talking about the Deuteronomic tradition of Judaism, where every 7 years, if you've lost your land, it's restored to you. Where when people finish the harvest, if they've left grain out, he says, leave it for the widow, the orphan, the exile, we would say the immigrant, the three groups that are powerless comparatively. And he's saying, this is what we have to come back to, our Judaism. So not only is he nonviolent, he uses a nonviolent set of strategies to work as a peacemaker.
Thank you. Your reading or your theology seems to be in contrast. And from what I read in the book, you're critical of St. Augustine. Can you delve into that a little deeper?
Well, I'm convinced that if we come back and do our theology of peace based on the Gospels, we will immediately move towards becoming an honest-to-goodness peace church. And if we did that, meaning Catholics and anybody else who gets it, because we've lost this tradition, there's a step there. The 3rd chapter of my book talks about the early church. And the more I read the fathers of the early church, I just couldn't believe how clear they were that they were bringing that shalom that Isaiah, every one of them quotes Isaiah and Micah about turning the spears into pruning hooks. And they are clear that they are doing it. And they're doing it because they're acting as Jesus acted. not only did they not join the revolt against Rome, Josephus says the Christian community, they're all Jews, left in 66 and went across the Jordan to a small town and didn't, whereas the Pharisees entered the revolt, the Essenes entered the revolt. And then in the next couple centuries, the Christians withstood 10 different pogroms against them by different emperors. And the only thing that happened as they resisted that, by Ignatius of Antioch, for example, year 110, he knew the apostles himself. He's being taken to Rome by soldiers from Antioch, the second most important city. And he writes 6 letters to the other churches in the area. And he encourages them all to continue to respond to Roman violence with love. And he writes Rome and says, please don't try to rescue me. I know I'm going to be ground by the lion's teeth. And he was. Well, what's amazing is to see what they thought about Jesus' message, turn the other cheek, which probably would help to explain what Jesus meant by that. It's not hit me, it's just the opposite. Maybe we can come back to that. But that's the most quoted phrase in the early fathers. I mean, they take it so seriously. Well, that went on 3 centuries, and the Roman Empire is converted. By 312, a third of the Roman Empire now was Christian, because they're so amazed by the way these people live. Julian the Apostate was an emperor who tried to come back to paganism. And he's quoted as saying, they take care not only of their poor and their sick, they take care of ours. Meaning those who are in the pagan religion. So their lifestyle is just, it is an amazing story. In the year 312, you probably know the story of Constantine and his cohort as Caesar. They issue a edict of toleration, saying Christianity is a legitimate religion. And some people think that's when it all changed. That now we were part of the empire, people could get roles in the empire and rise. Now they can join the army. Now they have freedom to spread the gospel. They see it as a great blessing to have the Roman roads and so on. And some people think it was the time of Constantine that was the fall. But as I've read it, Augustine comes 100 years later, so now they're now part and parcel. In fact, at the end of the 3rd century, no Christian could belong to the army. By the end of the 3rd century, a little after Augustine, under Theodosius, only Christians can be members of the army. There's a huge change there. But what Augustine did, he had 3 beliefs. One, human beings are just so rotten. They're upset by 3 libidos: sex, avarice, and domination. And they're a massa damnata. Very few people will be saved. And the only way they keep from ripping one another apart is the state. So you have to protect the state. It's limited, it's not city of God, but it's important. And it's a bulwark. And he says, war is always going to be with us. He does 2 other things that are directly contradictory to the early fathers. He reads the Old Testament. If you've ever read the books of the Old Testament where Yahweh is described as saying to Joshua and other generals, take over that town, kill them all. Has anybody ever been upset by those passages if you've read the Jewish scriptures? I think you would be. Well, the early fathers, unlike Marcion, who was an early, in quotes, heretic, who said, Jesus' God is so different from the God of the Jews, I can't accept Judaism. It's just totally different. Whereas all the other fathers said, no, we come from Judaism. And they handled those passages. They pointed out either allegorically, like Origen did, or they said, no, there's a gradual development in the theology of the way God is in the Jewish scriptures. By the time of Isaiah, we're hearing about a suffering servant. The book of Hosea, the prophet who says, my life is the fact that I've been faithful to my wife who turned against me. That's the way God is. So they handled those passages without rejecting them. Augustine came and said, God ordered war, see, it's okay. I know I'm being simple, but it's all there. And the other thing he did, they took very seriously the Sermon on the Mount. And he said, no, that has nothing to do with external action. It's all about motivation and purity of heart. So you can be a soldier, you can kill as long as you love. Well, I find that he couldn't find guidance for issues of war and peace from the Gospels. He needed to go elsewhere, and he went to a great classicist. He loved Cicero, and Cicero has this teaching called the just war theory. And Augustine adopted that, expanded it, if you know about the just war theory. And Christianity, ever since, that's been sort of the authentic teaching. Well, I see a place for the just war theory when Christians are talking with other people who have reason. There has to be some way to come to grips with that. But the Gospels go so far beyond deciding at the moment war is about to break out whether it's justified or not. I mean, the whole emphasis, resist oppression, change the structures, prevent war, build a community, what we're called to as Christians, peacemakers. So, yeah, I didn't know I was going to end up there on Augustine. I'm waiting for Gary Wills. He's a scholar at Northwestern. He was a very fine Catholic thinker. And I heard him a while ago on the radio, and he said, I've been studying in a great baritone basso voice. I've been studying Augustine, not Augustine, Augustine, for 45 years. So I can't wait to talk with Gary Wills about that chapter.
Thank you. I have one more question, but because of the limits of time, I'm going to open the floor up to others, and then I'll come back to my question at the end. So we're happy to take questions from the audience
or
comments.
Reflections, anything.
Well, while people think, you've come out with this book. You teach at Marquette,
Right.
in our Peace Studies department. So what are the implications for students of a new theology of peace?
Well, if anybody is interested or embraces Christianity, to any extent, and you try to make the life of Jesus the lodestone, he said, come follow me. And I think of this in terms of the Catholic Mass. What is he calling us to do? Well, I think it's clearly to act like he did. it's to be a peacemaker. Like Kevin is always bringing peace. That's Patrick's baby. Darling. He's calling us to be peacemaker. I think of the Catholic Mass. When I grew up, at the consecration, the priest says, "This is my body given up for you." And he says over the wine, "This is my blood of the new and everlasting covenant." And then he says, "Do this in memory of me." Do this. Do what? Growing up, I always thought that was change the bread and wine to my body and blood. And then when I went through the Second Vatican Council, and they changed the altar around, and they made it in the language of the people, and all those changes, then the do this meant not just change the bread and wine to the body and blood, but do this meant become a community that witnesses to the world. And the more I've looked at the Gospels, especially through the eyes of Gandhi, when I hear do this, my back straightens. Because I hear that as act like I acted, the way that got me killed. Do this. So that's the relevance for me. I think it should make a huge difference in our lives if we read the Gospels with a political sense. Walter Wink said, when we missed this dimension of the Gospels, we blew out, lost the keystone of the arch, and we fell into being a religion of personal salvation. Not a religion that took on the issues of the world.
A powerful challenge. Thank you. And Dr. Kenka.
So what are the practical implications for today of this message in light of social justice issues we have?
Well, when you see the last chapter is then a new theology piece, what does it lead you to? It leads you to peacemaking practices. That's where it leads. It's not pacifism, which is just saying I don't believe in war. It's peacemaking. And it's not the just war theory. It's a different paradigm. Where does it lead us? It leads us to use our imaginations. I can't believe in this last 60 years since Gandhi's death, how many people have successfully utilized the power of nonviolent action. One country after another freed through nonviolence, from Poland, South Africa, to the Philippines, Eastern Europe, if you really know the dynamics there. People organizing, people coming together. We just looked at the film in my class on Otpor, throwing out Milosevic in Serbia, all done by young people, organizing, frustrated, being creative. So it's these acts of resistance, overcoming oppression, but so much more has happened as people have used their imaginations. Who would have thought that nonviolent peacekeeping would work? There's the peace brigades, the Christian peacemaker teams, the nonviolent peace force. If you don't know about them, it's extraordinary what they have done in the last decade and a half. They go into countries and they say, we will accompany people who are under the threat of violence. So they started in Sri Lanka, they went to the Philippines, and it's amazing They stand with people who are under the threat of violence, and they keep violence from coming to them. It's almost miraculous. You know what the dynamics are. People are afraid, and these are peacekeepers from all over the world. They're afraid of what other countries are going to think about them if they injure these non-violent peacekeepers who are accompanying. They've moved on to the Sudan, where they're doing that work. They're now being invited into Syria. So I'm just saying, anybody who had imagination to take that path, it's a phenomenal peacemaking practice. Everything that's happening in restorative justice and healing circles, at school levels, the wonderful Peace Works program that the center has put on for the Boys and Girls Clubs, for the Catholic schools in Pilsen and Chicago, teaching nonviolent conflict resolution for young people. Healing circles, what Janine Geske has done here at Marquette, working with the criminal justice system from a whole different point of view, that it's not just a violation of a law crime, it's a violation of a relationship with people. So it's a cornucopia, I think, of peacemaking practices. And I'm speaking as a Catholic, it was a wonderful quote from the woman who started Pax Christi in the United States. She said about the just war theory, we thought it was settled teaching. Imagine the amount of speaking truth to power that could have come if we had gone back to the Gospels. So, is that beginning?
You gave us some examples of what you could do, like in Milwaukee, what you could do in Chicago, what things these students can think about doing in the face of oppression and injustice.
Well, I think the Peace Works is a great direction to go. They're inviting more people to learn nonviolent conflict resolution by teaching it to young people, which is a phenomenal gift. The testimony we had from families saying, it's made a difference in our house. The kids learned listening skills, and they brought it home. And we said, ooh, we as parents, we're learning from that. There's a group in Chicago called Catholics for Nonviolence, and I'm amazed at what they've done in a year and a half. It's same dynamics, what they're doing for gang violence. There's one parish that hosts basketball tournament, no great innovation there, but they have 2 rounds, and it's one gang against another gang. It's supported by Joachim Noah and the Chicago Bulls, but they then are invited to come to a Bulls game, but they have to come with other gang members. They have a full-time job placement service. They go out every Friday night to the street corners knowing where the violence might come. And these are other parishioners, and they invite people. And they say, they might look threatening. They want to be loved. They have so little opportunity. And they have a full-time GED that they can start whenever they want. And so, and the young man who reported on this ended his report by saying, the only thing that changes violence is love. I found him pretty credible. It wasn't love who was doing these things.
Thank you for the important message this evening. I really appreciate the important message. Dr. Kennedy gave me copies of 2 of your books, Jesus and Gandhi and Jesus Christ the Peacemaker. I started reading the first one.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. And if I may make some comments.
Please.
I have read about Gandhi a little bit, and I have also read Leo Tolstoy's non-fiction writings. And I was profoundly impressed and influenced by Tolstoy's non-fiction writings.
Yes.
And I'll make them as some comments, but you are welcome to express your...
Doctor's saying that Gandhi was influenced by many people, Western and Eastern, but Tolstoy was a big part of that. And he says his non-fiction writings.
So some of the things that you just mentioned reminds me of what I read in Tolstoy's non-fiction writings. And for the audience, there are a number of books that speaks just about some of the same things that Dr. Rynne has been mentioning. One is titled "The Kingdom of Heaven is Within You."
Yeah.
And the other is "The Gospel in Brief." The other one is "My Religion and My Confessions." And some of the important points that I remember from reading some of them is, that's a common notion that resist no evil. That's simply not practical in our society.
Right.
And the church, over a period of time, itself has given its own interpretation to suit its needs. Just like, in the animal farm, the animals got together and reduced all those initial principles down to one line. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than the others. So all the teachings of Jesus Christ have been, over the years, by the church, organized church, interpreted in a way to fit their temporary needs.
Right.
So when it says resist no evil, the church continued to fight for certain principles, used violence, and they justified it. Another principle is, so the Tolstoy's answer and Gandhi's answer, and I'm sure your implication from your lecture is that he simply meant resist no evil but love your enemies. And the rhetorical question from the common audience would be, well, all you accomplish is your own destruction. You're going to die. I mean, if you go to these violent areas and if you don't resist, you're going to get killed. But the answer is, has there nobody been killed because they resisted evil? There has been millions of people dead because they resisted evil. Maybe a few thousand will die if they don't resist evil. But the overall goal is just like Jesus Christ. Yes, he was killed, he was crucified, but see the effect of that crucifixion. And the other principle that apparently church and state have misinterpreted over a period of time is, there is a basic principle in the gospel that take no oath. What does that mean? It has been misinterpreted to mean that don't swear using God's name or heaven or earth. But Tolstoy says it means take no oath of allegiance to the state or the church, meaning you don't want to be in a standing army that is marching across to defend or to destroy.
Right.
So many of those
those are definitely books worth reading.
Principles are being misinterpreted and try to fit it to the present society and give it an excuse to use it in the state's interest or the church's interest. So those are very interesting readings, and I enjoyed your reading as well, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Other questions? Mike?
You mentioned, of course,
The Cardinals are winning.
Good.
Kristen.
Obviously, there's a conversation between Hinduism through Gandhi and Christianity, and of course Judaism. Do you see? Have you thought, as you wrote these books, of other connections with representatives of peace in other religions, or even the founders of other religions?
Well, I can't wait for that book to come out that's co-published by Irfan Omar and Michael Duffy, these two eminent professors. It was a wonderful conference. a year and a half ago featuring the various religious faiths. So I'm waiting that. Have I considered those? Yeah, I have Hans King's book on Islam. You know, I'm trying to really understand. I know enough about Abdul Ghaffar Khan to know that ISIS can be resisted and overcome by authentic Islam. Hinduism, you know, there's such a dose of understanding that way of life as you study Gandhi. Atman is Brahman, which is, you know, that the soul is God. Sure does help you get a footing on why we are really all one and why violence doesn't make sense. Is that personal?
Well, please join me in thanking Terry.
Thanks for being here.